Hello viewer base of indeterminable magnitude. So, I've been playing a lot of Zelda games recently. Not for any particular reason. Okay, maybe there is a reason. Yeah, as I'm sure you've heard from a couple of car commercials, we are in the middle of
unprecedented times.
Unprecedented times.
Unprecedented times.
But hey, because of the pandemic, it inspired me to go full turbo virgin and play through every Legend of Zelda game. Every single player Zelda game. Alright, just look at this list to see what Zelda games I'll be talking about in this video. I decided to play any Zelda game that was on the official Zelda timeline, with Breath of the Wild being added after that timeline was released. I also didn't play any of the non-single player games like Triforce Heroes and Four Swords Adventures because, well, I have no friends. So, fans of Link's crossbow training and Twilight Princess Picross, I'm sorry, but you can't take the top spot for best Zelda game in every Zelda list. I'd also like to mention that I'm a huge Zelda fan, and if any of these games is your favorite, I can totally see why. In fact, I don't even think the series has a bad game outside of one which we'll get to. All of this is just all my opinion and not an objective definitive list. Without further ado, this is my experience playing every Zelda game, along with a brief history of each game too. The tale of the first Zelda game is one that is as old as Robert Pattinson. Inspired by exploring the hills and countryside as a child in Kyoto, a young Shigeru Miyamoto started work on the first Zelda game in 1984 alongside a relatively unknown project called Super Mario Bros. While we don't know much about that project today, Miyamoto stated that he wanted the two games to contrast each other. Mario would be a linear platformer while Zelda would take its focus on exploration, attempting to recapture the magic that he had felt as a kid. However, both games attempted to diverge away from the high-score-based games in arcade cabinets that were popular at the time. With Miyamoto producing, Takashi Tezuka working on the story and script, and programming done by Toshihiko Nakago, The Legend of Zelda, titled after the game's princess who was in turn named after the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, released in 1986 on the NES. In the game, you play as a protagonist you name yourself, though the canonical name given to him is Link, which I'll be referring to him as in the future for the sake of convenience. This name was given to him due to the link you have between the real world and the fictional world of Hyrule in which the game is set. You have to collect 8 Triforce pieces from 8 different dungeons, then rescue the aforementioned Zelda from the weird pig demon that is Ganon. From these dungeons you get 13 different items that can help you progress or find secrets that give you more life or the capacity to carry more bombs and arrows. For many modern Zelda fans this comes off as pretty rudimentary, but it was extremely revolutionary for the time and would go on to be considered the granddad most action-adventure games and even RPGs to an extent. So, what are my thoughts on the game? Yeah, it's definitely one of the better games on the NES, but I'm just not in love with it like a lot of other people are. To be fair, it has a lot of depth with many different items, places to explore, and secrets to find all over the place. You go back into the world each time you get a new item with a feeling that you can go to a bunch of new places now. Is that feeling always justified? Not really. There definitely are a couple of key items that do drastically change the way you're able to explore, like the bombs or the candle. But can you really say that items like the latter really changed up the way you were able to play the game? As well, a lot of things are just too hidden. Without knowing the story or what you're supposed to do in a Zelda game, you kinda just get plopped into the world with just a cave. While this can be interesting and an incentive to explore for the first part of the game, after a while, searching for everything without even a vague idea of where it is can become very tedious. As much as I'm gonna lose that sweet gamer street cred for it, I had to follow a guide throughout the game, which honestly might be the best way to play the game in 2021. I've heard it described as if you have to follow a treasure map to get to each Triforce piece, and I still do think you have to gain skill by defeating enemies in dungeons and in the overworld. I do think the dungeons in this game are a bit more unmemorable compared to others in the series though, probably being the least puzzle-focused game of the series and revolving a lot more around combat. The story is fine, but it is also able to be summed up in like one page in the instruction manual alone and isn't explained much outside of it. This can probably just be explained by hardware limitations, and most early Zelda games didn't have the greatest story anyways. Call me nitpicking, but it is a reason why I haven't completely fallen in love with the game. On a more positive note, I'd also like to shout out the iconic score for the game done by now legendary composer Koji Kondo. From the infinitely memorable main theme to the mystic music that plays throughout the dungeons, it is beautiful in its 8-bit simplicity. As I'll mention later, I think his work with the Zelda series is easily among his best compositions. Through this score and its unique approach to gameplay for the time, it's definitely earned its classic reputation. However, it is very much rough around the edges and unpolished. It stands as a great foundation for the rest of the series, but on its own it doesn't really hold a candle to a lot of the other titles it would have to offer. As you may know, The Legend of Zelda did extremely well both commercially and critically. The game sold 1 million units in Japan on its first day alone and went on to sell over 6 million units worldwide. It was a phenomena at the time for sure. The game was considered a massive success, and of course it would need a sequel. That sequel does certainly exist, doesn't it? Going into a sequel based on the success of the original game, Miyamoto made a, well, strange decision. He completely reworked the team, leaving himself and Takashi Tezuka as the only people who had worked on the original game, still working as producer and story writer respectively. Along with those two, new co-directors Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura came on to work with the project. Perhaps the most baffling removal, though, was that of Koji Kondo as the game's composer. Instead, the composer for Ice Climbers, Akito Nakatsuka, was hired to do the soundtrack. In my opinion, it definitely did cause for a much weaker soundtrack compared to the original game, with the only real memorable songs being the title theme and the palace theme that anybody knows if they've gotten their ass kicked on the Hyrule Temple in Smash. With that out of the way, it was made as a direct sequel to the original game, with 6 years having passed since Link's original adventure. So I guess canonically 1 year in real time is 6 years in Zelda time, making the original events in Hyrule as old to Zelda characters as the formation of the UK is to us. So, history and lore aside, what was the game actually like to play? So, like I mentioned earlier, Miyamoto brought on some drastically different team members, which caused for a drastically different game. It actually kinda put the game in an entirely different genre. It had JRPG-style upgrades with a full leveling system for health and magic while putting less emphasis on the exploration items the series is now known for. Along with that, the game went to be mainly a side-scroller, with the original game's top-down perspective only being used in the overworld. These changes might have seemed strange at the time, but I'm sure there's so many elements that will be so beloved and stick with the series. In 1987 in Japan and 1988 in the rest of the world, the game was released as The Legend of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. I'm sure this game won't be the bane of my existence, right? Yeah, I find this game fascinating. Remember how at the beginning I said I only really dislike one Zelda game? Well, this is that game. Just every decision made here is so frustrating. Why do you have to grind for experience if you don't kill every single enemy the game throws at you? Why do they have every enemy take 10,000 hits to kill? Why does your experience reset when you die? Why does this game over screen give me a seizure? Why does every dungeon feel the same? Why, for the love of God, are there random encounters? But hey, at least one of the dungeon maps doesn't look like a hate symbol, so it's really on par with the first game if you think about it. So much of this game feels baffling, and I really don't understand how it isn't considered a bigger misstep than it currently is. Reception at the time was decently positive from critics and fans, but the love for the game has not lived as long as the others, and has a strange reputation among fans now. I just want to say that I don't have any ill will towards anyone involved. In fact, let's look at Tadashi Sugiyama's other recent work. I'm sure he's improved a lot. The series would see continued success with The Adventure of Link, spawning spin-offs like a Game & Watch game and the infamous cartoon series.
Princess.
As well, Miyamoto began work on yet another Zelda project for the NES. However, with the high profile the series was receiving, Nintendo pushed the game onto their upcoming console, the Super Famicom in Japan, or the SNES in other regions, and dedicated a high budget to it. Miyamoto for the third time was producer, but this time Kensuke Tanabe, who had previously worked with Nintendo on the Super Mario Bros. Games, was invited to be the story writer in Takashi Tezuka's place, who is now helping direct the game. To go along with these changes, Miyamoto stated his original vision was to have a full party for the game, in the same vein as many JRPGs. This idea would end up scrapped, instead continuing with Link as the main protagonist, but we would see a team used in the future in the Four Swords adventure games and Triforce Heroes. What did stick, however, was a lot of changes, or well, changes to changes, that more closely stuck to the formula of the original game. The first and most notable difference was that Zelda was a top-down game again. You could once again explore Hyrule without being in fear that some hellspawn would take you back into the underworld that is the side-scrolling sequences in Zelda 2. The combat was similar to the first game as well, except now your sword slash went in an arc instead of right out in front of you. Now the dungeons were themed, so you might have an entire dungeon based around a mechanic or element. For instance, the Desert Palace is filled with sand, the Ice Palace is themed around ice blocks, and Misery Mire gives me depression. Another thing this game fleshed out was the story, easily being the most in-depth Zelda story up until that date. It's still just Zelda gets kidnapped by Ganon, but this time there's a wizard too. But really, this game is the first to bring in so many Zelda staples that have become basically ingrained in the knowledge of any Zelda fan. Just ask anyone you can find on the street. How many elemental orbs do you typically have to get in a Zelda game? 3! The whole Zelda cliche of get 3 elemental pendants, get the Master Sword, get the Triforce, get to the bad guys started in this game. With that in mind, it's no surprise that critics and audiences loved A Link to the Past when it came out in 1991, and yeah, I love it too. Yeah, this is the first game in the series I can truly say that I love without any discrepancies. I think I would put it in my top 3 Zelda games just because of how groundbreaking and revolutionary it is. The series would go on to try and recapture the same magic that this game has, but this really has it in the bag by doing it one of the best ways and for the first time. Yeah, the story isn't much, but does it really need to be? The world is just so engrossing, the pixel art is probably the best the series has to offer, and having Koji Kondo back on the score significantly brings the atmosphere of the game to an entirely new level. This game was also the first Zelda game to introduce time travel, creating 2 separate versions of the same area with vast differences between them, which of course would become a series staple as well. A Link to the Past just changed so much, not just for Zelda, but for gaming as a whole. And as you can probably expect, the sales reflect that. A Link to the Past was one of the best-selling games on the Super Nintendo at over 4.6 million units, and is still one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. It's been put in lists of the greatest games of all time by publications like IGN, Entertainment Weekly, and GameSpot. So, with another extremely successful and acclaimed game behind their back, what would Nintendo do next? Create a follow-up on the same system? Wait for even better hardware to push the series forward? Give Link a fucking persona? Nah, they just put it on the Game Boy. Around the time A Link to the Past was being worked on, Nintendo's handheld system, the Game Boy, and its development kits started being handed around to various studios owned by Nintendo. Programmer Kazuaki Morita started work on a Zelda-like game for the system, and seeing the potential for this idea, returning director Takashi Tezuka asked Nintendo to greenlight a handheld Zelda game. It initially started out as a Game Boy port for A Link to the Past, but ended up being turned into an entirely separate game. This game would be titled Link's Awakening. Most of the team that worked on A Link to the Past ended up working on Link's Awakening as well, most notably Yoshiaki Koizumi, who was the scriptwriter for both games. A bit of interesting history about this game, it marks the first time a Zelda game did something to hype up its release. They held a tour in North America to see who could beat a test version of the game the fastest called the Zelda Whistle Stop Tour. Wait, does that make it Games Done Quick before Games Done Quick? After that tour, the game would be released in 1993, both in and out of Japan. The developers wanted the game to have an unrestrained feel, to stand on its own and not just to be another Zelda game. One of the main reasons for this is, and I guess spoilers for a 28-year-old game? So yeah, the entire plot of the game revolves around the twist that Link is actually in a dream the entire time after a shipwreck he had. The shipwreck is used as a red herring to explain why you explore the island of Koholint instead of Hyrule. Because of this freeform plot concept, the game is inherently less Zelda-y. This makes it basically the only Zelda game in the series to not involve Zelda, Ganon, or the Triforce. In fact, it's so detached from Zelda it even has a couple of references to Mario and Kirby. Tezuka himself even said that the game was more akin to a parody of a Zelda game than an actual Zelda title. Does that mean that the game is bad though? No way. In some ways, this game feels like a smaller scale Link to the Past, with less items and a smaller overworld, but a lot more charm in the way it presents itself. In my opinion, this is actually one of the few Zelda stories that stands on its own outside of the context of the franchise. This is because of the way the game hints towards its twist, and also just a lot of the characters here start to show some of the charm the series would become known for. However, the small scale does make the game a bit of a double-edged master sword. First of all, and I know this complaint is kind of strange, but I really don't like the items in this one that much. I think a couple of them have a cool concept, but by the end of the game their novelty really wears off on me. A much more obvious complaint is that the graphics on the game's original console didn't age too well. Even in color this game was a little confusing for me, so I couldn't imagine playing it in its original black and white format. Or, well, black and green? Black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow? The sound font of the console definitely does make me miss the more orchestral leanings of A Link to the Past. However, I can't deny the catchy and friendly quality that now beloved Nintendo musician Kazumi Totaka is known for, along with newcomers to video game composition Minako Hamano and Kozui Ishikawa. These guys did pretty good for their first video game score. Overall, it's a great game that's just held back by the hardware it's on, in my opinion. Maybe they should make a remake 26 years later. Once again, Link's Awakening did well with critics, though maybe not to exactly the same rapturous applause that A Link to the Past got. Commercially, it didn't do as well as the games that came before it, but 3.8 million units is still a lot. So, 5 years between games, that's something that Zelda fans really hadn't heard of at that point. So does that mean that the series was just dormant for 5 years? Well, not necessarily. There were a couple of games released under the Broadcast Satellaview or BS Online system for the Super Famicom. The game was split into parts, which would be aired as episodes, which you could access weekly once they released. Not only did we get these weird products of their time, but we also got the CDI games. Let me give a little backstory for those of you who aren't in the know about the CDI games. After a failed partnership with Sony to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, which in turn would inspire them to start work on the PlayStation, Nintendo partnered with Philips to make the CD add-on instead, being released as the Philips CDI. Because of this partnership, Nintendo allowed Philips to make games involving 5 of their characters, including Link, Zelda, and Ganon. The result of this came in the form of Link, the Faces of Evil, Zelda, the Wand of Gamelon, and Zelda's Adventure. And these games were just so good. Yeah, it's pretty well documented on the internet how bad these games are, and if you want to know what they're like, I recommend you just check out a video talking about them. From the low-budget JRPG tier voice actor,
My boy, this piece is what all true warriors strive for.
to the horrible game design, it's easy to see why these are once-in-a-lifetime bad games. The final release that happened during this waiting period was the Game Boy Color version of Link's Awakening, called Link's Awakening DX. Many consider this the definitive version of the game, since it was now in color, and it's actually the version I played for this marathon. However, DX would be overshadowed by a game that would come out just about a month later. Around this time, many mainstream games were in 3D, baby! Nintendo was no stranger to simulating 3D at this point, using the Super FX chip on the Super Nintendo to achieve 3D in games like Star Fox and Pilot Wings. However, in 1994, that little bitty breakoff with Sony started to really bite Nintendo back with the release of the PlayStation, the first console to really start advocating for 3 dimensions in the mainstream, and not just as a gimmick. Nintendo would follow suit in 1996 with the release of the Nintendo 64, and with it the company started to put their powerhouses in 3D. With Mario coming to the Nintendo 64 in 1996 and becoming both a critical and commercial success, it only makes sense that Zelda should come to the console too. Like the third NES Zelda, a follow-up to Link to the Past was planned, but the game was pushed to be put on the latest hardware. Miyamoto would once again supervise this game. This time he would do so over 5 directors. One of those was Eiji Aonuma, who designed the dungeons of the game, and let's put a star next to him because he kinda sorta becomes a huge deal in the franchise. With 3D gaming still being in a relative infancy, the development team had to take many inspirations from the outside world to put in the game. These came in forms such as Link's sword fighting style being influenced by the Chanbara sword technique and having stunt performers being studied by the developers in order to capture the motion for Link's arms in the game. The development team wanted the game to feel more mystical and fantasy-like than the other games, with Miyamoto stating he wanted the game to be cinematic yet distinguished from films. You can definitely see this vision through the commercials they released to tease the game. This time, the plot is much more expanded than the other games, with much more time being spent on characters, dialogues, and cutscenes than in the other games. The game starts out in the Kokiri Forest, where a young Link has to save his city's guardian, the Deku Tree, from a malignant spider-looking thing sent by Ganon. Through this, you find out that you have to save the world, and from there you see the reoccurring motif of time travel throughout the series, this time much more fleshed out than in previous iterations. You have to traverse between young Link's timeline and his timeline 7 years in the future. The game also had to vastly expand on its control scheme, with a button allowing you to target certain objects in order to focus combat on them, along with a little navigator or Navi to bring more life into the system. With all these ambitious ideas, a lot would ride on this game's success. The game would end up releasing in late 1998, and with that all being said, do I even need to tell you that me and so many others think that this game is good? Like, really, really good? This game's reputation almost precedes it in terms of content. You so often see it get the #1 spot on best video games of all time lists, and it's definitely not for no reason. The game is immaculately designed and is easily the loudest triumph Nintendo had made with the series so far. All of the dungeon designs here are pretty amazing, from the fun introduction of the Deku Tree to the eerie atmosphere of the Forest Temple to the bullshit of the Water Temple. Even Aonuma's first work on the series shows how talented of a game designer he is. The time concepts are really great too. The one example everyone points to is how the Song of Storms is a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, I like the way that things you do as a child affect how the world is in the future in more minor ways. From planting beanstalks to interacting with NPCs. The way that music is incorporated is amazing as well, through Koji Kondo's once again brilliant score, or the catchy ocarina melodies that you play throughout the game. The third dimension was able to give Zelda a whole new layer of depth, and not just literally. While I think other games in the series would expand this concept more, and with less clunky controls to be honest, this still feels like a magical experience. Ocarina of Time did extremely well, receiving extremely positive reviews from critics, and it became the best-selling Zelda game up to that point with over 7 million units sold today. You might know it as the game with the highest average Metacritic score for any game ever, with a 99. In fact, I might call it the OK Computer, Dark Side of the Moon, or Sgt. Pepper of gaming in terms of how widely beloved it is. So with an extremely successful game on their hands, one of the most beloved games in history, how would Nintendo follow it up? With a Wish You Were Here or a Magical Mystery Tour? Wondering how to follow up the ambition of Ocarina of Time, the team decided to make a game that was equal in length but shorter in the time it took to produce. This would be done by reusing Ocarina of Time's engine. This led the team to develop the mindset of compacting the game experience. The team for this game would be smaller than the Ocarina team, with the directors consisting of Eiji Aonuma, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Yoshiaki Koizumi. This game, like Ocarina of Time, would feature the concept of time travel, this time between 3 different days. These days would repeat over and over while the moon perpetually gets closer and closer to crashing into the new land of Termina each day. The story is a lot darker than previous Zelda games and often shows fear and weakness in the residents of Termina. It also has dark comedy that reflects and emphasizes its atmosphere. Koji Kondo also helps this atmosphere with his score, which has been described as having an exotic Chinese opera sound. The game also emphasizes an ocarina element by fixating on masks, which you use to put Link in different transformations to do different tasks. It's also different in the fact that it only has 4 core dungeons that you need to beat before you defeat the final boss. In August of 1999, the game was shown as Zelda Gaiden at Nintendo Space World, which was often confused for a promised expansion for Ocarina of Time due to it using an upgraded version of the Ocarina engine. The game would later release as Majora's Mask in 2000. In a lot of ways, it could theoretically feel like a downgrade from Ocarina, but honestly, I think I prefer this one. I know it's more of a popular opinion now than it was 20 years ago, but man, the story of this game just works in ways that Ocarina's didn't. The atmosphere is dark without being unnecessarily edgy, which is a problem I've seen other people have with other entries in the franchise. I mean, it's the apocalypse and you can feel it in the way characters act, and the story writing is simply top-notch. I know Zelda games' stories aren't typically held in super high regard, but when I see people like Shaffarilla say that this is his favorite work of art, I can totally tell why. This might be my favorite way that time travel has been incorporated in a piece of media. It's able to reset time that's passed without it feeling paradoxical. While the dungeons are less numerous, it makes each and every one feel more unique and fleshed out. Each dungeon is associated with a character, and you can easily remember their goals and motivations because of it. It also improves in flashiness on Ocarina of Time and fixes some, though not all, of the control issues that game had. I like how the Navi type character in this game feels less invasive and there's good tweaks to combat here. For me, it's aged better than Ocarina of Time, and easily manages to live outside of its shadow despite being a direct sequel to it. The game was another critical success for the series, but commercially it did significantly worse than its counterpart. In fact, it sold 4 million less copies. After such a quick development cycle, you'd expect the company would slow down, but hoo boy was that not going to be the case this decade. Unlike any other entry in the series, the story of the Oracle games does not start at Nintendo, rather at Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom. The head of Flagship, Yoshiki Okamoto, asked Miyamoto if he could produce a remake of the original Legend of Zelda game for the Game Boy Color. Apparently this idea went over so well that Okamoto was not only asked to make this remake, but 6 total games for the Zelda franchise. 2 of these games would be remakes, and 4 would be completely original titles to the series. Development on this game ran pretty roughly, as the team thought they would need to make major reworks to the game's design in order to make it suitable for new players. New players as in ones that hadn't played the original game. Disgruntled at the lack of progress being made, Okamoto went to Miyamoto for help, to which he suggested they make a trilogy of games, each representing a piece of the Triforce. This would comprise of the games Mystical Seed of Power, Mystical Seed of Courage, and Mystical Seed of Wisdom. And to everyone's surprise, these games would together be called the Triforce series. Wait, 3 games that have similar stories and graphics on a handheld system? Kinda reminds me of Pokemon. In Nintendo Space World 1999, the exact same presentation where Majora's Mask was currently being shown off, an early demo was shown of the game that would later become Oracle of Seasons. In this demo, Link had a Rod of Seasons which he would use to change the climate of the area he was in. It is too bad that Majora's Mask was probably the game that got all the spotlight though. Later in the development of the trilogy, Okamoto had the story team write the games to be affected by one another depending on the order you played them. He brought on Resident Evil writer Junichi Miyashita to bring the concept to life. Mystical Seed of Courage was later adapted into Oracle of Ages, and Mystical Seed of Power was adapted into Oracle of Seasons, and Mystical Seed of Wisdom was unfortunately cancelled. So much for the Triforce, I guess. So both Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages would be linked. This was originally planned to be done through a cell phone adapter, but the team opted for a password system instead. I really do like this system, and the ways you can interact between the games, though minimal, are pretty impressive for a handheld. Once again, the gameplay revolves around an object that changes the environment around you. Oracle of Ages continued with the time-honored Zelda tradition of traveling back in time, while Oracle of Seasons brings an original mechanic of changing the seasons around you to solve puzzles. Both games have their version of the Deku Tree, the Maku Tree, which you have to stop from being killed. Both, however, have their own unique maps and lands. Oracle of Ages takes place in Labrina, while Oracle of Seasons takes place in Hollow Drum. If you beat the antagonists in both games, Onox for Oracle of Seasons and Varen for Oracle of Ages, Twinrova, who have been overseeing the chaos, resurrect Ganon for a true final boss. With that all established, the games would be released simultaneously for the Game Boy Color in 2001. So, how did they turn out? These games are just a mess. An alright mess, definitely not incompetently made for sure, but a mess nonetheless. The concept of changing the environment through an object at certain locations was tiring to me as I got to these games, and the excessive use of it certainly made me even more tired by the end of them. You can definitely tell that these games were made, in part, with a team with not that much experience with Zelda, as they often failed to differentiate the moments that make the series special from its overused cliches. I will say, the dungeons and stories were fun while they lasted, with a couple interesting puzzles along the way, but this is definitely not a standout experience in the franchise. I also find them a little derivative of Link's Awakening and how they try and use the Game Boy system. The games somewhat stand out from one another, but it is still easy to group them in with one another, unlike Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Yes, these games are competently made, and pretty interesting in what they try to do. Like I said, I still love the idea of the two stories being interconnected despite not having a chronological order. These games do feel a little tedious, especially when played back-to-back in a marathon. Guess what? Like most other Zelda titles, the Oracle games were received extremely positively. Many consider these games to be some of the best on the Game Boy Color, and while I don't inherently disagree, these games are highly expansive in their world after all. The technical limitations of handhelds at the time meant there really wasn't much competition. But now it's time to talk about us real gamers. We didn't want any of those sissy handheld games. What was in it for us, huh? It's the GameCube era, baby. We get hyper-realistic graphics with hyper-realistic blood coming out of Sonic the Hedgehog's hyper-realistic eyes. The GameCube era of Nintendo was one that was a serious upgrade from the N64 era on many fronts. With the graphical capabilities of the consoles at the time, many people had very high expectations of what the next Zelda would look like. Graphical expectations were kept high by a tech demo at 2000 Space World which showed Link fighting Ganon in a seriously graphically updated Ocarina of Time cutscene. However, nobody knew what the Zelda team actually had in store for them. Aonuma, who was assigned to be the director of this new Zelda project, actually really hated the demo. He found it too derivative of other Zelda games, and he wanted to explore new directions to take the series in. However, exploring new directions had the team feeling lost. That is until they saw concept art for a cartoonish Link designed by Yoshiki Haruhana. This caught the eye of the team, and they decided that cel-shaded graphics would be perfect for the new Zelda game, to give it the feeling of a playable cartoon. From here, concepts of traveling to different islands and sailing across the ocean were conceived, and development started smooth sailing. A trailer for the game was shown at Space World in 2001, and with graphical expectations so high, well, people didn't like it. It was mockingly called Zelda and made fun of based on how strange of a change of pace it was for the series. However, when a playable demo was shown off in 2002, the game started to gain much more traction and attention. In late 2002 in Japan and early 2003 everywhere else, the game, now titled The Wind Waker, was released. Along with the game, there was a bonus disc for pre-orders which contained Ocarina of Time and a planned expansion which added more difficulty to it. In a lot of aspects, this follows suit of the Zelda games before it, but it also has a unique identity of its own. I wouldn't say it's as big of a shakeup for the series as Zelda 2 or even Majora's Mask, but it definitely carves its own path. The most utilized and obvious mechanic is the sailing, which is pretty well implemented, though after a while I do find it to get a little tedious. Fortunately, they introduce ways of faster travel later on, such as the Swift Sail in the Ballad of Gales. That brings me to another one of my favorite mechanics, the Wind Waker. Like Ocarina of Time, this game had a musical item that you used in order to perform magical abilities. As a music nerd myself, I do love it when these items are put in the series, no matter how cheesy they can be. Speaking of music, I also find that the score is amazing, and it's able to get a lively orchestral sound that other games were unable to achieve due to hardware limitations. Because of this new live orchestral sound and the short development time, Koji Kondo had 3 other composers working alongside of him, Kenta Nagata, Hajime Wakai, and Toru Minagishi. I also like the cartoonish twist it puts on the series through its animations and its story. It's able to realize Aonuma's original vision while still feeling like a classic Zelda game. Which, yeah, outside of the mechanics I mentioned earlier, it's just a well-designed Zelda game. The people who had initially decried this new game for its graphical style were shown that the idea could work, and damn it could work well. The dungeons are probably the best the series had up to that point, all having their own distinct atmosphere and uniqueness without feeling like there are too many cluttering up the game. The combat is improved from the N64 days, with flashiness coming from the cartoony style, which allows for it to flow more smoothly. The characters here are also really charming and memorable because of how expressive they are. There will always be a special place in my heart for Beetle, Medley, Tetra, Makar, and Tingle. The only things I find a bit underwhelming about the game is, once again, how much time you just spend sailing, along with, yeah, probably the most infamous part of the game, the Triforce Shard quest. Wind Waker has a unique endgame in that it really doesn't have a dungeon for you to complete. Instead, you have to collect 8 Triforce Shards, which you also have to pay rupees to decipher a map from. If you don't get a wallet upgrade before this point, it can be really tedious and boring. However, it is still one of my favorite Zelda games, and I consider it one of the highlights of the franchise. Well, the game did well critically and sold 4 million copies, but do I even need to say that anymore? Zelda and critical acclaim go together like Cars 2 and baked beans, League players and perpetual virginity, Capcom Zeldas and me never fully clicking with them. Capcom was still working hard on their own Zelda games, alongside Miyamoto and Aonuma. They released a remake of A Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance, which came out in the same month as Wind Waker. This remake had a separate mode called Four Swords, a separate multiplayer adventure where you and a couple of friends could take control of 4 different Links in a 2D style that was reminiscent of Wind Waker. Nintendo would take this concept and make their own sequel to it without Capcom, Four Swords Adventures, which would release in 2004. The main reason I bring these games up is because Capcom took heavy inspiration from them when making the next single-player title. Yoshiki Okamoto left both Capcom and the Zelda franchise in 2004, leaving the last major game he worked on as Four Swords. This left both Aonuma and Miyamoto to spearhead the project in his absence. Like Four Swords, this game would be developed for the Game Boy Advance and would take heavy inspiration from the Wind Waker art style. The main goal of this project was to put mechanics that previously only worked in the 3D Zelda titles into a 2D one. To do so, the developers experimented with size and perspective. From here, they developed the central mechanic of the game, the ability to grow and shrink oneself from a minute size. The in-game reason for this mechanic is so that Link can interact with a new race of people to the Zelda canon, the Picori, or as they like to be referred to as, the Minish. These concepts were fleshed out into the Minish Cap, which was released on the Game Boy Advance in 2004. The core gameplay here isn't too fundamentally different from other Zelda games. However, instead of completely changing your surroundings when you hop between worlds, it rather just has different paths and options unlocked to you. It can create for some interesting puzzles, but yeah, I just couldn't vibe with this one either. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. I'm not completely opposed to handheld Zeldas, I just never find them as fleshed out as their home console counterparts. I'll admit I think this is better than the games we previously got from Capcom and Flagship, but it just doesn't have the magic the series is known for in my opinion. I think Eslo is a pretty cool character, and Vati is certainly a serviceable villain, but I just don't remember much from playing this game. Nothing about the world really sticks out to me that much, and it doesn't really have a tone to it either. Some of the dungeons are well designed, thanks once again to Aonuma, but none of them would really rank among my favorites. It's a solid game, but in this franchise, solid doesn't really stand out that much. I get that lots of people do love this game today, but I just don't see the appeal.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Minish Cap did well critically, but commercially it's the worst selling Zelda game to date. This can most likely be attributed to the fact that the DS released a couple months before the game in North America. I mean, 1 million copies is great if you're an indie developer, but for Nintendo, well, it's not that great to say the least. So I guess the question is now, how would Nintendo follow up the biggest quote-unquote commercial failure in the franchise up to this point? Well, how about a sequel to one of the most divisive games in the series? In 2003, a new Zelda title was announced for the GameCube, though no more information was given out at the time. Like I just kind of alluded to, it was originally planned to be a sequel to Wind Waker, using the same graphical style and engine. However, Nintendo of America told Aonuma that sales of Wind Waker were sluggish, and the team decided to take a more realistic-looking approach, more akin to the tech demo that was shown 6 years prior. Inspired by the Lord of the Rings movies that were gaining massive traction at the time, they decided to go with a more gritty fantasy approach to the game. The team was asked to implement ideas they had wanted in Ocarina of Time, one of the main ones being horseback combat. A trailer of the game would be shown at E3 2004, to much more universal acclaim compared to that of Wind Waker. Around this time, the game was revealed to be standalone and no longer a sequel. Another element that was added was, say it with me now everyone, traveling between two worlds. In this realm, however, Link would transform into a wolf, similar to how he transforms into a bunny in the first visit of the Dark World of A Link to the Past. This world would be known as the Twilight Realm. The concept was based on a dream that Aonuma had about being a wolf locked inside of a cage. Wait, is Aonuma a furry? Well, whatever he is, he left the team in the middle of production to work on the Minish Cap, and when he returned, he found the game was not what he wanted it to be. He found it to be not as revolutionary as the game other developers were working on for the DS. With Nintendo's next console on the horizon, at the time called the Revolution, Aonuma decided to push the game back to simultaneously release on this console and the GameCube. The team decided to implement motion controls in this game by using them to swing the sword, shoot arrows, and do numerous things from the first-person perspective. However, since Link was typically portrayed as left-handed, and the majority of people are right-handed, the team not only decided to invert Link's model and controls from the GameCube release, but the entire map as well. The game would release as Twilight Princess for the GameCube and the now called Wii in 2006. So, I should probably get this out of the way. I'm super nostalgic for this game, as it was my first introduction to Zelda, and I still absolutely adore it to this day. The game is actually pretty dark. It's the only mainline Zelda game to be rated T instead of E by the ESRB. And while this tone might not come as naturally as Majora's Mask, I think it puts you in the mood through its dark character moments and haunting sound design. I know I keep saying it, but Koji Kondo always continues to outdo himself with each subsequent soundtrack. This time he was assisted by Torumi Negishi and Asuka Ota. Once again, I'm extremely fond of the characters here. The children are a bit annoying, but you still feel bad when they get terrorized by the game's badass side villain, King Bulbin. I also think Zant is a great villain who works for the game's dark tone better than Ganon, who, yeah, is the eventual final boss, but story-wise, Zant is the evil son of a bitch you gotta stop. And of course, there's Midna. Midna is still one of my favorite video game characters ever, due to how well they bring her into the game and interact with Link through her dark sense of humor. The game is also just fun to play. The motion controls don't feel in the way if you play the game on Wii. Both versions I would recommend to play, despite how the motion controls were kind of forced in as the game finished development. It's yet another game in the series I fully love, and it brought me enough goodwill during the next couple of sloggy games in the marathon anyways. How many times do I have to read this phrase on Wikipedia? Twilight Princess was released to critical acclaim and commercial success. For a brief time, it even outsold Ocarina of Time and has almost sold 10 million copies total. So now that we have a game that helped revolutionize the motion controls of the Wii, let's get to the game that really revolutionized gaming, alright? On October 6, 2004, Miyamoto said 9 magic words that would completely change gaming as a whole. We're thinking of bringing 4 swords to the DS. That's right, you are going to be able to play as Link on a rudimentary touchscreen. I can basically feel his tunic! In fact, the mentality of transferring 4 swords to the DS is basically what started out most of the development process. At E3 2005, the game was announced as a classic Nintendo phrase, "Ayo, there's going to be a Zelda game on the DS." At the Game Developers Conference the year after, the game was formally announced as Phantom Hourglass, now detached from the Four Swords series and instead a sequel to Wind Waker. However, unlike Twilight Princess, which was also planned to be a Wind Waker sequel, this game would follow the same graphical style as the game it intended to follow up. The game would be given a promotional trailer at E3 2007 and would be released the same year for the DS. Originally, the game was going to be played with the main action of the game being played exclusively on the top screen while the player would control Link from the bottom. However, after a while, the developers thought the game would take too much time transferring focus between the screens. Instead, the team decided that the entire game would take place on the bottom screen, with the top screen being reserved for maps and other non-essential gameplay tools. They felt that this style of gameplay would be more likely to appeal to the Japanese market. You know those Japanese, always wanting good gameplay, I guess. This would also be the first Zelda game to use Wi-Fi, using it for a battle mode. It's easy to tell that the developers really wanted to market this game to the more casual audience that the DS had. Did it turn out good though? Well, not really, in my opinion. For the first time in a while, Aonuma wasn't the director of this game, instead passing that duty over to Daiki Iwamoto. And to me, it shows. It just does not feel authentically Zelda, if that makes sense. Now, you can take my critiques with this game with a grain of salt, because I was definitely playing on 100% legitimate software, but I found the controls super frustrating, and I don't feel like my thoughts would be any different if I played on an actual DS. Call me a traditionalist, but I don't think the touchscreen works with this style of game quite well. Maybe having to tap where you want Link to go works, but the way that sword combat is built into the game is just frustrating and feels very restricted. With everything being controlled from the touchscreen, there are just so many ways you can mess up without it feeling like your fault. I also don't find the dungeons to be that fun, especially Temple of the Ocean King. This is a dungeon you have to repeat multiple times throughout the game, only getting a few more puzzles each time you revisit. I find it to be such a tedious game and a mediocre playthrough experience, especially compared to the game it's following up. I think one of the best ways I can show this is through the boat segments. While in Wind Waker you feel fully in control of where you're going, and like you are really out on a vast ocean, the sailing in this game is just pick a path and occasionally you'll have something to do on the way there. It's just not a very engaging game, and on the rare chance it does engage you, it's pretty frustrating. And finally, story-wise, while I think the story is a nice continuation of Wind Waker's story, I find it to be much less grandiose and fun as that game's story was. Though I will admit I did really like Linebeck, please don't kill me. Well, it's time for me to say it again. The game was critically acclaimed, blah blah blah, it brought new life into the series' age-old concepts, blah blah blah. Who's ready for a sequel? Taking notes from Majora's Mask, Aonuma told his team that he wanted the sequel to Phantom Hourglass to come out as quick as possible. Once again, the team would be sticking with the same art style as Wind Waker. However, they decided to change the story and gameplay from its two predecessors, not wanting it to be too Zelda-like. For instance, Tetra isn't present in this game, and instead they went for a more traditional look of Zelda. However, there is one twist on her. She's fucking dead. Why did the team decide to kill off its star princess? Well, they wanted to have a single player control two different characters. Story-wise, this is explained through Cole, Zelda's advisor, needing Zelda's body to resurrect the antagonist Malladus, who he secretly works for. He succeeds in taking Zelda's spirit away from her body, and she now has to help Link solve puzzles by controlling suits of armor known as phantoms. Another staple of its two predecessors that was removed was traveling by boat. Instead, Aonuma implemented a train system, which was inspired by a book his son loved called The Tracks Go On and On. Outside of those two major changes though, the gameplay and dungeons are pretty similar to those of Phantom Hourglass. The game would be released as Spirit Tracks for the DS in 2009. Although it's very similar to Phantom Hourglass, I like this one quite a bit more. I wouldn't put it in my top 5 or anything, but this game is definitely a step in the right direction compared to its predecessor. For instance, they got rid of the Temple of the Ocean King, instead opting for a dungeon you complete progressively instead of repeating over and over. If you want a modern comparison, I guess I'd say it's like Mementos from Persona 5. And while the travel still is pick a path, I find the concept of riding a train and zooming through Hyrule to be a lot more interesting than doing so on a boat at this point. Like the game before it, Spirit Tracks still has a problem with its dungeons and story being uninteresting, but I still enjoyed my time with it. I also do like how the team tweaked the control scheme to make it feel more responsive, though I still wish the touchscreen controls weren't there. Now this is strange, critics didn't overwhelmingly praise this game, they just said it was fine. Commercially it did just fine too. It feels like everything for this game was just pretty average. Sales were average, reviews were average. God, it feels so weird to say that about a Zelda game. It's a shame because Phantom Hourglass was showered with praise, and I think this is a step up from that game. Zelda's 25th anniversary is right around the corner. I'm sure there's a masterpiece in the waiting for the series. So yeah, 2011 was a pretty big year for Zelda. The first game, and the series as a whole, was turning 25 years old this year. One of the first ways they celebrated was releasing a remake of Ocarina of Time for the 3DS, updating one of the most beloved titles in all of gaming. But Nintendo wasn't just planning on releasing a remake, a full original Zelda title was in the works. Production on this new game started back in 2006 after the release of Twilight Princess. Aonuma was back on producing duty again, with Hidemaru Fujibayashi as director. The main vision going into this project was to create a game as ambitious as Ocarina of Time for the Wii. The main experiment that this game is famous, or, well, infamous for, is its implementation of advanced motion controls through the Wii Motion Plus. The team said that the swordplay in Wii Sports Resort, a game that also used the Wii Motion Plus, was the main inspiration for this mechanic. This allowed for more control options, as all the sword fighting would be taken care of with motion controls. The biggest dimension that the team explored was speed, where Link could run at the cost of stamina. Aonuma has later stated that he wanted the game to be open world, but he had to cut it back to Wind Waker style islands due to hardware limitations. So how would you travel between these islands? Through a boat like Wind Waker? No. Bird. This game introduced the species of Loftwings, which you could fly through the sky using motion controls. The game was also going to be a lot more cinematic than any other Zelda game, with 2 hours of cutscenes and a story meant to be the origin of the Zelda universe. You see, around this time, Nintendo confirmed a theory that all the Zelda games were interconnected in a timeline, and then split into 3 separate timelines based on whatever outcome you reach in Ocarina of Time. Since this was meant to be the origin point, it addresses topics like the origin of the Master Sword, how Hyrule came to be, why different incarnations of Link and Zelda watch over Hyrule, etc. The convoluted nature of the timeline at this point explains why this game is so lore-heavy. The main plot is that an ancient evil, Demise, has been sealed in Hyrule by the goddess Hylia, and therefore she has to put the people of Hyrule in the sky to protect them. However, if Zelda's power given to her by Hylia is used, it can resurrect Demise and set him free on the land once more. Link is chosen by the goddess to stop fan-favorite villain Girahim from reviving Demise and to protect Zelda in the process. Side note, but something that was released in tandem with the game was the 25th Anniversary Orchestra. It's a collection of old and new Zelda songs played by a live orchestra, and it's easily one of my favorite pieces of video game related music. I seriously recommend you give it a listen if you consider yourself anything of a Zelda fan. The CD actually released alongside some copies of the game, now known as Skyward Sword, for the Wii in 2011. This is another one that's super interesting to talk about. I'll even say it, I like this game. I find it to be pretty good overall, probably better than the 2 games that came before it. But I know you probably want me to discuss it, so let's address the huge, gigantic, Wii motion-sized elephant in the room. The motion controls just suck. The motion controls were just not precise enough yet. It feels like swinging your sword around randomly is a more viable strategy than actually properly positioning it. The reason they worked in Twilight Princess was because they didn't require accuracy. More, swinging the Wii remote was just a replacement for the B button. And the story, while I do like the bits of lore they put in, it just does not feel as grandiose of a story as the developers wanted it to be. And outside of the 2 fan favorites, Girahim and the sexy beast that is Groose, I find the characters to be so boring. Link's another blank slate protagonist, Zelda's nice but she's rarely in the game, and the rest of the characters just exist. And its scope is just too big for its poorly implemented control scheme, causing for some pretty unmemorable puzzles. While I like where the game is going for, it just feels so poorly executed. Many have this written as the worst 3D Zelda, and while I can't refute that, it is a tough crowd to compete with. The game did well critically on its initial release, but as of now, a lot of people have changed their mind on it.
You're like a spoiled rich kid who gets everything bought for you your entire life, and then when it comes to making it on your own, you can't take it. You expect everyone to love you because you are who you are, part of the illustrious Zelda lineage. Nothing could possibly be wrong with you. You look just like a Zelda, but you're not one. You're a pampered, doughy snob wearing nice clothes, expecting to graduate scot-free because your daddy's an alum.
And the sales seem to reflect this too. It's the worst selling 3D Zelda with only 3 million copies sold. With the series not having a big hit since Twilight Princess, they only did what any logical company would do. They made Link to the Past 2. The story for the development of A Link Between Worlds begins after the completion of Spirit Tracks, for which most of the team went on to work on Skyward Sword. However, 3 members from this team, the leader of which was Hiromasa Shikata, were set aside to develop a new game for the upcoming handheld, the 3DS. The original idea for the game was a concept centered around communication, but this was shut down by Miyamoto, who called it outdated. The team went back to the drawing board and came up with the concept of Link merging into walls, going from 3D to 2D, which was approved by Miyamoto in 2010. Development started, but quickly stopped after the team was disbanded to work on Wii U games. In 2012, however, Aonuma decided to revive the project after the completion of Skyward Sword and growing demand for a 3DS Zelda game. Initially, the original team was not invited to rejoin the project, instead having Kentaro Tominaga taking Shikata's place. After a while, 2 of the 3 original members would be put back on the team, Shikata alongside Shiro Mori. Yeah, the 3rd member of the original team was done pretty bad. I can't even find their name anywhere. Though it was originally going to be another installment in the Wind Waker trilogy, the team significantly changed things for the 3DS. For instance, they opted for a much more traditional control scheme, only using the touchscreen in order to switch items and interact with menus. However, they did make this game a sequel, instead to A Link to the Past instead of Wind Waker or Spirit Tracks. It uses the same world and general layout for Hyrule and the Dark World, which is now called Lorule. You travel from Hyrule to Lorule using the 3D to 2D mechanic, replacing the magic mirror. However, it has a different plotline, different dungeons, and focuses more on letting you complete the dungeons in any order you want. This was done by an item rental system in which you pay a merchant named Ravio to rent an item to use, which you lose if you die. While the plot is different from Link to the Past, you have to get the same MacGuffins, the pendants, the Master Sword, and the sages. The game was able to be finished 1 year after it was picked back up and released in 2013 as A Link Between Worlds for the 3DS. Oh shit! My copy of Link Between Worlds was under me this whole night! Me too! Same here! This game gets slept on a lot, huh? Yeah, I'm gonna say it. I think this game is great, and I think it's the best thing they had released at that point since Twilight Princess. I think it manages to stand on its own with all the new mechanics they throw at you, and is able to distinguish itself from the other Zelda sequels because of it. For me, it stands with Majora's Mask as the good way to do a Zelda sequel. Unlike a lot of games in the series, every piece of land feels used, which just goes to show how good the original map was. It's just a no bullshit kind of game. Maybe a little unambitious, but I don't think the series was lacking ambition at this point. I still do have my problems with it. It's still a little derivative of A Link to the Past, and not all the dungeons are winners. With that being said, this game needs a lot more love in Zelda discussions. Critic, like, commercial, 4 million. Ooh, ah. Let's just move on to the last game in the series so far. The time in between A Link Between Worlds and our final stop in the marathon is quite an interesting period in Zelda history. That doesn't mean that the series was dormant, far from it actually. In 2014, we got a spin-off of the Dynasty Warriors franchise with a Zelda twist, called Hyrule Warriors. In 2015, we finally got another multiplayer Zelda game with Triforce Heroes, along with a 3DS Majora's Mask remake. However, all these spin-offs and remakes couldn't quench the thirst that Zelda fans had for a new, original title. However, it would still be a couple of years before this game would actually come out. For this game, Aonuma and crew said they wanted to break any and all conventions Zelda had had up to this point. They wanted to recreate the same freeing feeling as the NES game, and to do so, they created a prototype in its style so they could test out new mechanics. The main thing that was experimented here was weapon type, so you could use axes and boomerangs rather than just swords. However, perhaps the main vision of the game was to test if players could solve puzzles in multiple different ways. The developers' answer to this was a fully open world game, the map of which no other Zelda game even comes close to in size. Instead of attempting to expand the number of actions Link could do, the game looked for the many different ways that Link could interact with the environment, and the environment with him. Like the Wind Waker, the graphics would be cel-shaded, but they would be more akin to a Ghibli film than a Saturday morning cartoon. Key locations were based around architecture from Kyoto, with futuristic Sheikah technology taken from the Jolmon period of Japan. The music would also be more ambient, focusing more on the atmosphere than immediate catchiness. One of the biggest changes came with the cutscenes, which would be the first fully voice-acted cutscenes in any Zelda game so far. A brief trailer was shown for the game at E3 2014, with release scheduled to be in 2015 exclusively for the Wii U. From there, it was delayed to 2016, and then to 2017. With rumors spreading around that a Nintendo console was coming just around the corner, people started to wonder if the game would release for the Wii U at all. This console turned out to be the Nintendo Switch, and with it came Breath of the Wild, the new Zelda title, as a launch game. The game would release for both the Wii U and the Nintendo Switch in March of 2017. Alright, here we go. There's no hyperbole that this is not only my favorite Zelda game, it's my favorite game ever. So let's get my one slight critique out of the way before I absolutely gush about this game. Yeah, it's the story. While I like most of the characters here, especially the Zora and the Rito, and I like Zelda's arc about coming into her own, I just don't think there's much here. I like how it's a post-apocalyptic Zelda world, with Ganon on the brink of taking Hyrule, but it just doesn't leave you with much to think about, you know? That being said, this game absolutely kills it with atmosphere, whether you're admiring natural beauty or feeling excited going to your next boss. And visually, the world is gorgeous and is on par with the Ghibli films it takes inspiration from. Exploring every inch of the land is magical. There's something to find in every nook and cranny, despite how large the map is. It's always so fun to go off the beaten path and find mini dungeons called shrines, koroks, or side quests. It takes all the pre-established conventions of Zelda and morphs them into something completely new. It fully realizes its open world and innovates the genre in so many ways. Definitely worth the hype in my opinion. Accordingly, the game got heavily praised, probably the biggest amount of praise the series has seen since Ocarina of Time. It's also the best selling in the franchise, being the first to sell over 20 million units. Lots of people have been introduced to Zelda through this game, and while it wasn't my first, it must be a hell of an introduction. The game also got 2 DLC packs, one that released summer 2017 and the other winter 2017. I definitely recommend you get the latter if you're a fan of the game, as the Master Trials is just a bunch of fun challenges. And that's it. That's every mainline Zelda game as of now. There have been a couple of remakes and spin-offs in the series since Breath of the Wild. In 2019 we saw a Crypt of the Necrodancer spin-off starring Zelda characters called Cadence of Hyrule, and a remake of Link's Awakening for the Switch. 2020 had the sequel to Hyrule Warriors, which is set in the Breath of the Wild universe, and pretty soon we're getting a remaster of Skyward Sword as of the recording of this video. It looks fine, but it doesn't have the additional content or the graphical upgrades that the previous re-releases had. The most notable Zelda media coming up, though, is a sequel to Breath of the Wild, which was teased at E3 2019 and given an official trailer this year. Needless to say, it's a sequel to my favorite game ever, so I'm really excited. So the Zelda marathon is done. While not every game clicked with me, I really did enjoy the marathon as a whole. Zelda is so dominant in gaming culture that it was very interesting to see the series evolve from its origins until now. I liked going over each game, doing research on the development and trying to state my opinion as best I can. I'll put my ranking up here, and if you want to know what games to start with to get into Zelda, I would recommend A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, or Breath of the Wild. This took a lot of time and effort for my first real attempt at a video, so I really hope you guys enjoyed. So yeah, like, subscribe, comment, rate 5 stars, bye!